Welcome to Tech Takeaways, the podcast taking technology's largest challenges and chomping them down into small little bite-sized chunks. I'm your co-host, Jason Fitzgerald, and I'm joined as ever by my dynamic co-hosts, Wayne Miller.
Hi.
And Paul Stringfellow.
Hi.
So this episode is around cloud optimization. So guys, what are we talking about?
Well, I've sat in a couple of readbacks of cloud optimization recently. And I didn't really understand a lot of what was read back, so I thought it'd be a great episode for us to talk about it. So this all came about from organisations who've got Azure. We've got some software that looks at the Azure tenancy and will give them some optimization information.
Yeah, and I think it kind of does what it says on the tin. It's for the cloud, and it's about making sure you're using cloud correctly. And I think lots of us are aware that, particularly when we talk about Azure, so for those listening and watching, separate this out from software as a service. This is not about Microsoft 365. This is more about we're using Azure, we're using AWS, we're using Google Cloud, Google Compute, GCP. So we're using those kind of things. And if we just move into those platforms without proper consideration, we can create ourselves a bunch of problems. And I think there's two areas. You're talking about these optimization reports. It's not the only way to find this information out, but they're useful reports to give you a snapshot view of what does my cloud usage look like. And really, there's two things that come out of it. One is that we can look at the security posture of that cloud infrastructure inside of Azure in this case. But we can also look at the way that those resources are costing. So every resource we run in the cloud got a cost associated with it. We run a virtual machine, it costs us. We run a virtual machine all the time, that bill continues to get bigger. And often we will leap into cloud with maybe certainly a set of common mistakes. And some of those common mistakes tend to be just put it in the cloud and it'll all be fine after that. And
won't it?
We'll come to that. And we'll put it in the cloud, and cloud's they're cheap. Because actually you look at the headline figure, running a virtual machine cost me £1 an hour. That's not very much, is it? Well, it is when we run it 24 hours a day, because £1 an hour suddenly becomes £24 a day, suddenly becomes a couple of £100 a week, suddenly becomes thousands of pounds a year. And then we start to think, oh, heck, actually buying a server over a three-year life cycle is only a third of the cost of taking that in the cloud. And often that's because we've just taken what we did on-prem and just shoved it in the cloud and not really thought about it either from a security perspective or from a cost perspective. So, that's kind of the areas that people need to think about. Jason, is there anything that you've seen in addition to that?
Yeah, I think that the ease of deployment with cloud compounds this issue because it's so easy to just spin up a new VM to do whatever it is. And that VM is essentially a throwaway VM from the off, but then it becomes more and more ingrained into the business, and before we know it, it's actually in production. I think that's part of the issue, the ease of access to adding to the cost. I think the transparency of cost as well is probably quite an issue in that, as you said, on the face of it, it looks like a fraction of a penny to run a virtual machine, but then what about the storage associated to that? That carries an additional cost. The bandwidth, that carries an additional cost. If we're doing any kind of snapshotting of the machine, that carries an additional cost. And realizing what those costs look like and being able to predict them and forecast them is really difficult to do. If we look at the reports that we run, typically we run them over a period of 3 to 4 weeks. And what that will do is it will run automatically against the environment to inventory everything that is running, but also its utilization as well. So it'll identify things like this virtual machine is sized to be 32 gig of RAM, but in reality, it could be a 16 gig of RAM, half in your cost, or maybe not half in, but saving you significant cost savings there. And doing it that way instead. So it'll make predictions and metrics based on what it sees over that period of time. And often what we see is, if you were to take some recommendations, say, for example, reserved instance. So Azure has got and AWS and Google have got this as well. Reserved instance is the idea that you're going to pay for that resource for a year or 2 years or 3 years. So I'm going to commit to it up front, as opposed to a pay-as-you-go model. Doing that could save up to 40%. And this will make recommendations on that.
Yeah, and I think you made a really good point as well about kind of it's not just looking necessarily at the cost of running a service. So, if I run this VM and it turns out to, it cost me this much.
Yeah.
So I could run a smaller VM because actually I'm not using resource. I think that's an important thing. But I think another important thing, and you can see this in, there's all kinds of tools that are available to do this depending on the kind of information that you want. And maybe we'll come back to this before we wrap up, because I think there's some things that you can do before time. So rather than moving to the cloud and finding all this out later, there's some things that you can do that maybe drive this beforehand to get a better view. Because one of those things that you can look at, one of the mistakes that I think, and I think companies make this mistake much less now, but certainly one of the things that you can do is taking the way that we run services on-prem right now and just moving them as they are to the cloud is almost defeating the object a lot of the time, because sometimes what you'll find is that if we took the time to re-architect the way that we use that application, we could be taking advantage of cloud native capabilities that not only give us the ability to much better take advantage of the flexibility and scale of cloud, but also we'll probably do it an awful lot cheaper. If we take a database as an example, if I've got a big SQL database on-prem and I've decided that the right home for that is in the cloud, and maybe even I've done the resizing of my VM correctly, so I'm just using the resources that I should need, that will still be an awful lot more expensive than if I looked at that database and said, well, could I re-architect that as SQL as a database service, for example, or even re-architect that into a cloud-native database that runs a little bit differently, but will be more efficient for cloud, will scale, will be potentially cheaper to run. Because I've re-architected it, it will be cheaper to run than an optimized VM inside the cloud. Because VMs in the cloud are actually quite an expensive resource for all the reasons you talked about, Jace. It's not just the compute, there's the storage. If we're retaining snapshots, there's the networking infrastructure that goes around it. Whereas actually with a number of these kind of cloud native services, then we can build those services. It takes some work to get there. You've got to re-architect applications a lot of the time to move them there. But it's a big part of understanding why we're moving to cloud in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that a great example of that is retail. If we look at cloud used in retailers, they often use cloud slightly differently. But if we take your example there of cloud native services versus how we would traditionally architect it with servers, for example, most retailers get busy around the back end of the year. November, December, January sales. That's 3 months of the year where their transactions are done. Maybe in some cases 80% of transactions are done during those 3 months of the year. And so you need a system that can scale up quickly. Obviously it's going to incur cost as it does, but then ramp back down at periods of low demand. So if we were to take a cloud native application that does that, well, that's great, because there's a cost per transaction. So end user, so retailer makes a sale on their website, there's cost per transaction. And as that website gets busier, the service flexes up to maintain a performance. So you make sure that you're receiving all the orders because the service is guaranteed to do it. And then during end of January, February, ramps back down. The cost per transaction is still there, but you're not paying for it for the rest of the year. The flip side of building that is you build something really big that is running 24/7, 365 all year round. That costs in February, March, April, when it's lower.
Might be a daft question. Can't you scale, if you were on top of your environment, can't you scale that pre-built environment down, or is it not as easy as that? And is that why these reports are a report?
It's not as easy. So the reality is it's not as easy. If you take something like, so we're picking on databases, but if you take, I don't want to pick on Microsoft SQL per se, but if you pick on SQL because I'm going to do it.
As a database,
but if you pick a SQL is not designed to automatically scale up and scale down. So as Jason said, you're going to build an architecture there that is relevant for the thing that you might need at worst case. And you don't have the ability. So if I take a modern database, a modern database has the ability to add more and more capability. And then when you finish with that, it will remove that capability. But because the database is designed to do that, then you can do it. But SQL isn't designed to do that. So I can't keep adding nodes into SQL for when it's really busy and then easily take them out again.
Yeah.
But actually I wanted to ask you Wayne, in terms of, because, you mentioned that the inspiration for this episode came from these kind of read-throughs on reports we've read. What's been kind of the feedback from customers who've had them done? What's been the things that have come out? Have they seen the opportunity to save money?
Savings, cost savings have been a big one. I'm not technically comfortable with some of the stuff, some of the outputs that come into it, but I look at a cost saving and a security analysis. Cost savings, I think we've, certainly on the last two, we've shown savings of about 24% on average. And that was for a number of reasons, which I can't explain. I think reserve instances was one of them.
Yeah.
And then there was kind of areas where they could improve the secure score. There was areas that they could improve the secure score just on some recommendations. So for me, we've done a lot of these on 365, and we've identified areas where we can reduce costs, we can improve security. This is exactly the same, but in Azure, we've done quite a few of them now. But these are the first kind of big savings that we've seen. These are organizations where they've got 500 plus employees, multiple different servers. They've been in the cloud for maybe a year or so, and costs just keep going that way. So this is in some cases is giving them an element of control or predictability, and then by keeping the software in place, they can keep they can predictably forecast to the business of what costs are going to be in the future. And I think that's what's not available at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Yeah, being able to forecast is quite difficult natively, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, and I said we'd kind of come back to this earlier, that that's not just a problem once you're in, it's actually a problem before you make the move as well. We've had this conversation with a number of customers, haven't we? We've come to us and said, I want to move this thing to the cloud. And it doesn't really matter what this thing is, but I want to move this thing to the cloud. We've seen this with storage particularly. And can I put it in one of the hyperscalers? So that's a Google, an AWS, Microsoft. Can I put it there? And how much is that going to cost me? It's not quite as easy as saying, I've got 50 terabytes of information, I want to put that in the cloud. It's not as easy as that, because actually there's a whole bunch of other calculations that have to happen before you get some kind of idea of what that's going to look like. So that's a real challenge, and we've worked with some other partners who can give us flat rates for doing that, and that's great. Makes that process easier. But I think from a design point of view, so from a FinOps, FinOps is the phrase that tends to get used, cloud FinOps for this, so financial operations. From a point of view of I've moved the stuff into the cloud, actually having a tool that can keep an eye on that storage cost or those service costs is great. But I think there's also tools and processes out there that can allow us to look at that beforehand. I think that's an equally important part of this, maybe even more important, because it will allow you to have a more accurate prediction of what your costs are going to look like. So I've spoken with a couple of service providers, cloud providers, for example, cloud software providers, who can do that. Look at your current architecture on-prem, and then help you from there to look at things like application dependencies, size of machines, and then map that to each of the cloud providers, the main cloud providers, or including you can put in your own data around a colo facility, or keeping it on-prem, as an interesting comparison. And then it's the ability to be able to look at that information, give you some idea of what the cost will look like in the main cloud providers, but also give you an idea of what it might look like if you were to re-architect. So instead of moving SQL as is onto a virtual machine, move SQL to SQL DB, move that database, re-architect it to something else, because you've then got an idea of how all these things tie together, you can get a much more accurate representation of cost. That doesn't mean that you don't need to do the thing that we've talked about, which is keep an eye on this going forward. But it's a really complicated problem, and I think the ability to be able to get visibility of it either beforehand or once you've moved to the cloud is essential. And Jace, you talked about at the start, it's quite hard to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And just touching on visibility as well, we always say with cybersecurity, the more you can see, the better off you are. And the report that we run will highlight security issues as well. We've seen over the past few years GDPR data breaches because storage buckets, so storage areas in cloud environments aren't secured in the way that they should be. This will highlight that. You've got data sitting in this in this environment. We recommend that you reconfigure it slightly to make it more secure. It'll highlight all of that as well. So not only do you see cost savings, predictable cost measures, but it may highlight things that you weren't aware of that may pose as a risk to the business, which is, I feel, quite important. So if we just...
well, I've got one last question, because I'm always asked, how do we onboard? And not being a sysadmin or a techie, I always defer it to you. So
absolutely, yeah. So onboarding is really simple. What we do is we provision the service. So it's an automated service. There's nothing for the customer to deploy. What we do is we send over to the customer a hyperlink to the system admin. So the system admin needs to have access to be able to run this, to be able to pull the metrics out that we need to report. But essentially, we provide the link to the system admin. The system admin can use that link while signed into the cloud platform to then set up the report to run. So then the report will run automatically, and we come back to that roughly 3 weeks later with the full report, which is typically about 15 to 20 pages long, with a whole host of metrics around cost savings and security recommendations.
Brilliant.
So fairly simple to get onboarded with that. Yeah, great. So we hope you've enjoyed this episode. If there's anything around cloud optimization that you'd like for us to take a look at, get in touch with us. We're available online. Just search for Gardener Systems. And we hope that you've enjoyed this episode on the podcast. We're available everywhere you get podcasts, and you can subscribe on YouTube as well.